Hi, this is Justine from our sewing room. Thanks again for joining us on a sew along tutorial. Today we're going to be doing Pattern Emporium's Grab a Cuppa cardi. There's a few lengths to choose from, so check the measurements out in the sewing tutorial and work out what length you're going to make. I have done mine in the long and the hip. That's the style that suits me the best and enables me to wear it with pants and jeans. So today we're going to sew it in the hip length. I'm also going to add buttons to the front placket today as well. Also check your fabric requirements and the types of fabric suitable for this top. It is a knit sewing pattern, so make sure your fabric is a knit fabric. I've made it in a few different types of fabrics that all sit well. Today we're going to be using our beautiful soft sweater knit. So go ahead, do your measurements, check out your fabrics in the tutorial, grab your pattern from the link below if you haven't already got it but love the look of the sweater, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel because every time we post up a new video you'll be alerted to it. So thanks again for all your feedback, really enjoying your comments, and I hope you enjoy sewing along with me today. So once we've cut out all our pieces, I'm just going to go through what you should have. So make sure you do all your notches. Your notches are really important for this pattern to match up the neckband and the hemband as well. So first of all, I've got two pieces of the cuff and they have the notches in the center. So you should have two mirrored images of the cuff. And by mirrored images, we just mean opposites. The cuff is the same, so that won't be an issue. You will also have your long neckband, so that was cut on the fold. So you'll have one long narrow piece. There's several notches in that, which we'll go through as we get to the tutorial. You will also have a hemband. This is slightly wider. Again, it's cut on the fold. I had room to cut mine on the side of my fabric, so I'm actually going to do a side seam on mine. We also have two sleeves. So remember, notches again along the top of the sleeves. We have two separate fronts, so don't be confused with cutting them on the fold because this is a cardi. You'll need to have your fronts separate. So you'll have two front pieces and then you will also have a back piece that is cut on the fold. So go ahead and cut all your pieces, cut out all your notches, and then come back and we will start our sewing. Our first step in our tutorial is to sew our shoulder seams together on our front and our back pieces. So this is my back piece, so I've laid that fabric right side facing up, and you need to grab one of your front pieces. So we put that with the right side facing down. Now we can see that beautiful V-neck will create the center of our cardi. So what we want to do is match up the shoulder seam at the front with the shoulder seam at the back, having that V-neck sitting towards the front. Now our front piece is the wrong side facing up and our back piece is the right side facing up. So if you match those shoulder seams together and making sure that they're aligned perfectly at the neckline and also at the shoulder seam, and we just want to clip or pin them together. We're going to sew them using an overlocker. If you don't have an overlocker, you can use a sewing machine and using a stretch stitch. Our seam allowances for this is 6 mil, so we will just go and overlock along that edge. So while we're there, I'll also grab my other front piece and do the same thing. So again, that's wrong side facing up and our V neckline facing towards the middle, and I will just clip that at the neckline and then again at the shoulder seam, and then I will just continue clipping along that second shoulder seam, and then we will just go over to our overlocker and sew them together. So because this is a very stretchy fabric, I've got my differential feed set up just to 1.3 to allow for that, and by determining that I did a test. So I'm just going to add that into the foot and sew along these two side seams. By adding the fabric under the foot before you start, it just helps it create a really nice even start. We don't have the fabric pulling against the differential feed. So just go ahead and overlock the other seam and then we'll move on to the next step. We're now going to attach our sleeves to our garment. So as you can see, we've now sewn our shoulder seams together. So what we need to do is open our cardi out and so that is the neckline facing away from me, and then this is the sleeve edge facing towards me. Sleeve does not go the whole length of the cardi. Where those bits on the pattern jut out is where our sleeve edges will sit. So we need to find, and you will notice that if you've cut your notches out, on the back section here I have 2 notches cut out. Just move that along this way so you can see. I have the 2 notches cut out on the back section, and I have 1 notch cut out on the front section. So what we're looking for now is our sleeve piece. We want the corresponding sleeve piece to match when we're facing them right sides together. So I've now got my sleeve facing with the wrong side facing up, and my bodice with the right side facing up. Now I want to make sure that these double notches on my sleeve match the double notches on my cardi when it's all facing right sides together. So what we want to do is match up the sleeve to the bodice. Using the center mark on the sleeve, we match that to that overlock seam that we just did. We then grab the edge of our seam, and where the edge of our cardi is, as I mentioned before, the cardi comes straight up, out and around. So where this bit juts out here, that's where the edge of our sleeve will match. So we need to match that to our cardi. And making sure again in this final step that the single notch of the front of the sleeve matches the single notch front of the cardi. If it doesn't, you've got the wrong sleeve piece. Just simply change them over. So now go ahead and match and clip this together all the way along. You should not have to stretch any of the fabric. The sleeve and the bodice of the cardi should fit beautifully together without being stretched. So now you can see I've attached the front section of my sleeve to the front section of my cardi. I now do the same with the back section. Again, where that little bit juts out, that will be the edge of where my sleeve attaches to. So go ahead and pin that. Now you might have to overlock a little bit of the bodice here to attach the sleeve. So go ahead and put the bodice in, making sure that the sleeve is anchored by the foot of the overlocker, because we need to take that initial clip out and you don't want the sleeve to be moving. So if you even want to make sure, give it a couple of hand winds so that that sleeve is going to start off when you hit the foot presser on your overlocker, just so that it doesn't move as you start to attach it to the bodice. And always making sure that there's no lumps as we're going, feeling with your hand. If you can feel lumps like what's happening over here, simply just rearrange your garment so that it's sitting nice and flat underneath that sleeve. And as you can see, I've just run off the edge of the bodice a little bit here just to anchor that sleeve down and over here where it started at that initial point. So go ahead and do the same thing with the other sleeve, and then we'll continue on. Now what we want to do is keep our cardigan with the wrong side facing out. So lay it down on a flat surface. We now want to attach our side seams. So what we want to do here is, starting with our underarm, is where those seams meet on our underarms, is we want to match them together. So we want to take the front and the back seam, pressing both of those overlock seam towards the base of the cardi. So I just start off by putting a clip in there with those seams facing down. I then move on down to the edge of the sleeve and pin that together as well. So we've turned our cardigan in just so that you can see how it's sitting nice and flat. And now I just want to pin along this sleeve edge. So I'm attaching that front of the sleeve to the back of the sleeve, and I'm just going to pin that, clip that all the way along. I've clipped that under the arms there as well, and then I want to continue on to the base of the cardigan. So you'll have 2 side seams to do this for. If you go ahead and clip both of the side seams, and then we're going to sew them on our overlocker. You will notice that the natural fall of the garment is to come in on an angle like this. As we're sewing it, all we need to do is just ensure that it actually sits straight to feed through the overlocker, and I will show you that step when we get up to that. So I'm going to start at the sleeve edge here. Again, I prefer to have my presser foot of my overlocker to start down, put the garment underneath and just sew along that edge that we've just clipped. Now I'm coming up to that underarm seam edge. Now remember how I mentioned that it was on an angle? So all you want to do is just make sure that we're sewing that, and we just pull it straight to sew it around. You can see how I'm just making sure that that's straight. And you can see there that we've caught that underarm on the straight as we've overlocked it, and it will naturally fall down into a curve. So just go ahead and repeat that on the other side, and then we'll continue on. We're now going to prepare our hemband. So our hemband is the wider of the two that we cut before. Now if you were like me and were able to cut it saving some fabric, we just need to join those end pieces together. If you've cut it on the fold, you can disregard this step. So if you haven't cut it on the fold, you will have allowed a 6mm seam allowance. So all I'm going to do now is just join that short edge seam together on my hemband where I cut that, not on the fold. So I'll just go ahead and do that, and then I will come back. What I've done is just ironed that with the wrong sides facing together. So I've now got my hemband with my right sides facing up. Now we want to locate the notches that we've made. So I'll show you where they are. We have obviously our ends are still open, so that will be the front of our hemband. And then moving along, you'll find a single notch. So just mark that notch. That will match up with our side seams. We're moving along, and you should have made a center back notch, or you will have that seam where it's joined together. Moving along, you'll have a third notch, and that will be the other side seam. So if you just mark that with a clip, we'll have our 3 notches marked by the 3 clips. What we want to then do is attach this hemband to our garment. So we'll start with our raw edges, matching our raw edges of our cardigan. I've got the cardigan with the right side facing out, and I want to attach my hemband to the front section. So this is the front section of the cardigan, and this is the bottom edge. So I've now got the bottom edge of my hemband, that's the ironed fold there, that's facing upwards, and I've got all 3 raw edges of the hemband matching with the raw edge of the cardigan. So I just want to match these 2 front bits that are open to the front of my cardigan, and then moving along where that first notch is that we put the clip in on our hemband, I want to match that notch to the side seam of my cardigan. And then moving further along, you will notice at the back of your cardi you also had a notch too. So where that notch is on the main bodice of the cardi, we want to match that to that center back notch, or the center back seam, whichever one you have there. We then go continuing around the base of the cardi. We also then want to match up that second side seam with the second side seam notch with the side seam of the cardi. And then again, lastly, we'll match that front, which is open, and we have the 2 layers to the front of the cardi. So there you will notice that you will need to stretch this waistband slightly to match. You see how there's this little bit of extra fabric, it doesn't fit perfectly. We do need to stretch only the hemband. We don't want to stretch the main bodice of the cardie to fit. So it's only a very minor gentle stretch, but this will help give the cardie shape when it's hanging. So between that front notch, that front clip and the side clip, I just want to gently stretch that hemband, making sure that all 3 raw edges are aligned, and then put clips along there to hold it into place. It's a very slight stretch. You shouldn't have to be doing too much stretching. The most important thing here is to make sure that all 3 edges are aligned, so you have a nice even hemband when we sew it together. So you can see now I have that hemband attached to the front section of my cardie, and I'm just going to continue between all the clips doing the same thing. So now I'm working between the side seam clip and the center back clip, and I'm again just going to very gently stretch that hemband to match with the cardie, and then I'm going to clip that all together, making sure that my raw edges align. So if you go ahead and continue clipping all the way around or pinning until that hemband is attached to the cardie, then we can go ahead and sew it. We're now going to attach that hemband to our cardie. So we're going to sew that all the way around. Remember to only stretch the hemband, don't stretch on the cardie. So again, I prefer to put this over my foot presser to hold it, just because my garment fabric is very stretchy. And we just sew all the way along. We now have a neckband piece that we've cut, and what we want to do is attach the fusible interfacing pieces. If you're not attaching buttonholes on your cardie, you can skip this step. So what I want to do is actually open the neckband. It's sitting on my table as such. That's the folded end and the open end. So all I want to do is just pick this up from the one corner and turn it like that, so that I'm not twisting my neckband. I then want to apply the fusible interfacing pieces to the inside part of my neckband, and they will meet at the bottom and just finish halfway up. So always make sure that the interfacing is the sticky side down. Just iron this down so that it sticks together. While I'm down at my iron, I'm also going to grab my neckband piece, and I'm going to fold it wrong sides together with the right sides facing up. So just like that, all the way around, I'm going to fold that, and then we're going to create a crease by ironing that together. So we're going to grab our neckband still, and we're going to fold it right sides together. So right sides facing together, we're going to pin along this short open edge here. So we've now pinned along our short open edge. Now to stop this from twisting, what would be best to do is just fold this in half all the way along with the right sides facing together, and just to make sure that we haven't twisted it up at all, we also want to pin the open end together on the other side. Then we'll go over to our sewing machine, and we're just going to sew along this edge here. So we'll have 2 edges of our neckband to sew, and we want to just sew them with a long straight stitch on it, or a straight stitch that's just slightly longer in length than what we normally use, just so that your machine doesn't get caught with the stitches. Go ahead and sew them on your sewing machine, and then we'll come back and I'll show you how to finish that off. So where we've folded our neckband, where that folded edge is, and we've sewn along here, what I want to do is take my scissors and just cut that corner of that folded edge off. So you'll end up with a nick out like that. Be careful not to cut into your stitches. You're just simply cutting that corner off to reduce the bulk. Then what we need to do is press that seam out, so you'll have like a little V at the end. Using your finger and your thumb, what you want to do is push that V into the right side, and that should then, when you turn, create this beautiful edging of your neckband. So just go ahead and do the same thing on the other end, and then we'll attach the neckband. Our cardie, where that we put that hemband on earlier, and we've got our neckband piece where we just turned out to the wrong side. So what I'm going to do here is, so we want the interfacing bit to be on the top if we have interfaced. So first of all, what we want to do is grab the bottom of our cardie and the bottom of our neckband. We want to put the raw edges together. Now it's really important in this step that we align the bottom hemband with the bottom of our neckband. So just make sure they're neatly aligned. Pop a pin in there so they don't move. Pop a pin in at the other edge so it doesn't move as well. And just keep pinning that all the way along. So as you can see, I've matched up the bottom hemband with the bottom of the neckband. This is a really important step because you want to make sure that it's going to sit nice and neatly when you're wearing it. Now what I want to do, you will notice that there is a mark on our neckband. So we want to get that mark and we want to match that up to the first mark on our cardie. Sorry, it's a mental blank there. So we'll have our 2 notches on our neckband and our first notch on our cardie, and what we want to do is just pin them together. We talked about those reference points before. So now what I have is the bottom section matched and that first notch matched. This section in between that first notch and the bottom here will not be stretched. It should fit perfectly. So what we can go ahead and do is just pin that together. And the reason I'm pinning and not clipping is I'm actually going to go over to my sewing machine and I'm going to baste this so it doesn't move when I prepare my overlocking step. So now you can see that I have attached that part of the neckband together. I'm going to go ahead and do that again on the other side, making sure that we do not twist the neckband. So for this next step, make sure you've set your sewing machine to a basting stitch. If you're not familiar with a basting stitch, this is the longest length of a straight stitch that your machine is capable of. Most machines will have it preset. It just looks like a very long, wide dashed line. Now, what we want to do is baste our sections that we've just pinned. So I'm going to start at the bottom. And what I'm going to do is sew across that bottom section that we've pinned in. And I just want to make sure, I'm going to leave my pins in. I just do not want that neckband to move at all. So hence why I'm basting it with my pins in. Now that I've done 1 row of basting, I know it's not going anywhere. I'm actually now going to, next to that row that I've just done, I'm just going to do a 2nd row of basting stitches. I just want to make sure that that just is not going to move at all because that will affect what the garment looks like at the end. So I've now got 2 rows of basting stitches across that bottom section of my cardie. Now what I'm going to do is do a basting stitch all the way up to where that first notch was on that V. So where we've pinned it, we just want to baste along there. We can remove a basting stitch at the end, so if you go outside of the seam allowance, that will be okay because we can remove it at the end. However, with a basting stitch, you do not want to do a backward and forward stitch at the beginning or at the end, as this will make undoing it quite a mission. I'm just going to go up to that mark where my final pin is and cut that off. So now what I have done is just basted, which is a temporary stitch, up to that first reference point and down to the bottom hemline, and then I've done 2 rows of basting across the bottom. So if you do that on the other side, and then we can continue on. We talked about our reference points before being our centre back and our 2 shoulder seams and our front notches. So let's go and anchor our neckband to those reference points. I find it easier to start at the centre back. So that centre back, I've now folded that, match that up to that centre back notch. So that's in the main bodice piece at the centre back. So I pop a clip in there, and that's one of our reference points marked off. You will now notice right beside that centre back we've got some more reference points on our neckband. They're fairly close. They're only about a handspan away from that centre back seam. They are our arm seam reference points. So let's match them to our seams of our shoulders. Now we've got our second reference point matched there. We are stretching between that centre back notch and that shoulder seam notch. We do have to apply a fair bit of stretch in there. That will just keep that neckline sitting nice around your neck. So don't be worried that you have excess fabric on the bodice part of your cardi. We are going to stretch that neckband to match. So our neckband in. So there is a fair bit of stretch on our neckband there to fit. Now again, the same on the other side. I'll locate that notch, which I'll match up to the shoulder seam. And then I want to create a fair bit of stretch on the neckband only, not the neckband of the garment, and clip that to hold it in place where I've stretched it. So now we've got our back neckband piece attached to our cardi. Our neckband. And then if we just go and repeat that for the other side as well. We now have our neckband completely attached to our garment via the clips and the basting stitches. So now what we want to do is we want to go and overlock that neckband to our cardi all in one continuous overlocking section. So when we get to our edges here, we just want to make sure, because that we're basted, that they stay nice and tight together. And then we'll go and overlock that, and then we'll come back to our next step. So with these ends that we've sewn together, we've now got our overlocking tail hanging out at the end. So a nice way to neaten that is to not cut it off, because then your overlocking could come undone. But grab that tail and just push it upwards towards the top of the garment. So where that tail's sitting, it's now sitting in your overlocking. So what you now need to do is just go over to your sewing machine and just do a zigzag stitch at the very end. Now be careful that you don't go over the seam allowance of the overlocking, but if you just do a zigzag stitch, say from this bit here to this bit here, about 1 centimetre, and then you can cut the remainder of the tail off. So repeat that for both sides. It doesn't matter whether you put your overlocking underneath on your garment or on top of your garment, but just make sure that you're pulling it fairly firmly so that there's no excess threads hanging off underneath your garment, and a zigzag stitch over the top of that will anchor it down. Now before we go ahead any further, my suggestion here would be to cut off all these loose threads, remove all your basting stitches so that you don't forget to do them later. So you can either pull them out with your fingers or using an unpicker very, very carefully. You do not want to rip your garment at this point. So step here, this is where we would cover stitch along the outside of our neckband if we want to do that. To do a top stitch with your cover twin or a twin needle on your machine, just make sure that that seam that we attached the neckband to the garment is pressed towards the garment, so that you'll be top stitching on that seam as you go around the neckband. So don't forget to start right at this hem and go all the way around in one continuous top stitching step. Starting at this seam where the sleeves are joined together, stitch 2 rows of gathering stitches on each sleeve edge. Remember, a gathering stitch is just a long length straight stitch. So we want to stitch one at around the seam allowance and one just inside the seam allowance, and leave the tails hanging out so that we can pull them later to gather our sleeves in. So this is our cuff with the notch facing up. And we're just going to fold at that notch, and then we're going to sew along that seam that we just folded on. This is nice if you sew it on your sewing machine using a straight stitch, because it then sits nice and flat when we open it up. So I'm going to sew that down on my sewing machine for both cuffs. We've now sewn both of our cuffs using that short straight stitch. I now want to press those seams open using my fingers, and what I want to do is turn these cuffs to the right side. So that's the seam we just made, leaving it open. I'm now just going to push that through and just turn it so that it's folding on itself, and we've got our right sides showing. So just making sure that that seam that we just made, that each edge of that seam is sitting open inside of our cuff. We can go and iron this down just to make sure that it sits nice and flat in our cuff. So we want to put a pin in that seam that we just made where we've joined that together. Now you'll notice on the other side of your cuff there is a notch, so we also want to mark that with a pin because we need to match that up on our sleeve. So we'll have 2 pins in our cuff, one where our notch is and one where our seam that we just sewed is. Now we grab our sleeve edge and we turn this in so that the wrong side is facing out. What I want to do is grab my cuff, and where that seam was that we just made and we put a pin in, I want to feed that inside my sleeve, and I want to match that up to the sleeve seam. And that's where we started all of our gathering stitches. So I'm just going to move those tails out of the way, and what I'm going to do is grab that seam, pop my cuff inside my sleeve, and match that seam up with the seam on my cuff. So I'm just going to pop my pin back in, this time catching the actual cardi seam as well. So I've now pinned my cuff inside of my sleeve to my cardi. Now you'll notice on the sleeve that there's also a notch that we cut out on our sleeve. I want to match that notch to that notch that we pinned on our cuff. So I'm also going to pin that. Now, you will notice now that the cuff is sitting on the inside of our sleeve and we have all this fabric left on our sleeve. This is where we perform our gathering. So pulling up 2 of the loose tails, I now want to gather this sleeve to match in between this pin here and that pin there. So I'm just going to distribute the gathers evenly between the 2 pins until my fabric has matched the length of my cuff. So you can see now the gathering stitch here that I've just pulled the threads of and sitting evenly is now sitting evenly with the cuff. All the gathering, I just want to make sure it's nice and even between the 2 pins, and then you will match that with the edge of the cuff. You can see the 2 pins. So just again checking that it's even, and I'm just going to pop my pins in to that sleeve edge, matching up the 2 sides of the cuff and that gather that we just performed then. Now with those tails that we used to gather, what we like to do so that that gathering doesn't come loose, I like to wrap that in a figure 8 around that first pin so that we're just securing that gathering from coming loose while we do the same thing on the other side. Okay, so on the other side, I'm just going to grab those 2 loose gathering threads. If you can't see them, you can pop your pin in to drag them out, and just gently pulling those 2 gathering threads to gather up that sleeve, making sure that that gathering is distributed nice and evenly and that it's matching with the cuff. So just using your fingers, spread it out so it's nice and even. Making sure your two cuff edges are aligned with that gathered sleeve, and then just pin them together. So we'll have our gathered sleeve pinned to the cuff all the way around. And again, those gathering stitches that I just did, making sure they're nice and even. And those tails, I like to thread around that pin in a figure 8 so that it doesn't come loose. To stitch all the way around, catching all 3 edges, including our gathering. So I like to overlock this with the gathering stitch facing up, and just so that I can see the pins and not run over them with my overlocker. So if you just go over to your overlocker or sewing machine if you're not using an overlocker, and just stitch that all the way around the armhole, and then repeat that on the second arm, and we can come back and we are nearly finished. You will have to sew this fairly slowly so that you can pull the sleeve out as you're sewing. So I'm just going to sew the first section. I'm coming up to a pin, so I'm just going to stop. What I then do is grab the next little section out from underneath, making sure that I'm only sewing through the cuff and the sleeve. So I'm just going to remove this pin, and I'll just sew up to the next pin. And you can see how that's all folded underneath, so I don't want to continue sewing. I just want to grab that garment and just pull that next section of the cuff out so it's sitting nice and flat to sew. So you usually will only be able to sew a couple of inches at a time. So I'm just going to pull that orange pin out, and I'm just going to sew now up to the blue pin. Again, stopping at that pin, pulling the garment out so that it's sitting nice and flat. And as I said, we just want to make sure that we're not catching anything underneath here. So you can see the other edge, so I'll just push that away, and making sure that this is sitting flat and that I'm sewing through my 3 edges. Stopping at the next pin and just repeating again. So just pulling that section out, removing my pin. Stopping. Now that we've attached our cuffs, don't they look fabulous? Don't forget to remove those gathering stitches, so you can just do that by pulling them out, making sure that you can't see any gathering stitches on the outside of your garment. Another little tip when you are doing the gathering, sometimes I do like to use a different coloured thread so that you can easily locate that gathering stitch later down the track to pull it out. Nearly finished. If you're not adding buttonholes, your cardi is done. So go and press it and enjoy wearing it. If you're sewing the buttonholes, let's go and mark the placement of where we want our buttonholes to be. So traditionally on women's garments, the buttonholes are always on the right hand side when you're wearing them. So that would make it this side on my cardi. There is a template included in the pattern for placement of the buttons. Out of respect for Kate, I won't show that on YouTube, but it has got markings on it of where to line up with the hemband and lining up with the bottom hem of your cardi. So let's go ahead and mark those buttonholes. I'm just going to pop this pattern piece on my garment because I can see through it where I'm marking my buttonholes. This is where I want them to start. Kate has 4 marked here on for the hip length cardi, so I'm just going to follow her guide here. So I'm basically just putting pins where the top of the buttonhole will start, and I'll remove that template and pop my pins into where I want the top of the buttonholes to start on my buttonhole placket. I've got my 4 pins of where I want my buttonholes to be. I'm just going to pop that over the top of my garment and just see if I like how that looks. I'm going to grab my buttons and put them on the top because that's what I'm actually going to see as I'm wearing the garment. So we've done our buttonholes now according to our template, and I just want to show you a little trick for doing buttonholes on a stretchy fabric or a knit fabric. So I'll just show you on my sewing machine how I managed to do the buttonholes and have them sitting nice and flat. So head on over to your sewing machine and have a look at your different buttonhole options. What you're looking for is something very similar to a number 62, and that is actually made for knit fabric. So just have a look at your guide and don't be tempted to just use your standard buttonhole that you normally use, because most machines will have a setting for stretch fabrics. So just show you here is how to open them without damaging the rest of your fabric. So this is a little trick that my mum showed me, and this is how I open my buttonholes. So I start down at one end, I just poke my seam ripper in past that first end, and I hold the fabric with 2 hands at this end, and at the same time I'm pushing my seam ripper really slowly and really carefully up through the fabric. So I want to just push it through until I get to about halfway. So you can see here I've opened that hole up halfway. Now what I want to do is turn this buttonhole around and do the same thing from the other end. So putting my seam ripper in just before the double stitching ends and holding the fabric with the thumb and forefinger and just pushing this slowly towards the end. Now because I've already opened that one end and I've gone halfway up my buttonhole, I know that the seam ripper is not going to go through the bottom and continue on ripping. Now that looks a little bit wavy, so once I press that, that should sit nice and flat. And now I have my beautiful buttonhole. So if you just continue on to do the buttonholes, and then for the final step you just need to sew on your buttons corresponding with your buttonholes on the opposite side of your cardi, and then we have them finished.